what's going on. Can you explain what's going out at Lizard's Revenge?
Yeah, well, there's 500 people here, which is just totally amazing. There's just an incredible turnout, and it's a really positive and powerful presence, and we're getting an unbelievable amount of mainstream media coverage, and a fair bit of that is either neutral or sympathetic. So for lots and lots of reasons, this has been a really positive event. Yeah, the first day we did a protest march up to the gates of the mine, and that was fine. There was no dramas then. Yesterday we wanted to take the Lizard Mobile out to the gates of the mine, and that's a car which has been decorated, and Uncle Kevin Buzzicott was travelling in that car, but they refused to let us take that to the gates of the mine. So there was essentially a standoff which lasted for a couple of hours, and unfortunately we had to give up, and we're still negotiating with the police about what's going to happen today and in following days. But we're definitely going to do another march up to the mine gates today, and hopefully we won't be stopped by the police this time.
So there are probably lots of people that have no idea what's actually going on at Olympic Dam. Could you just tell us a little bit about, what's actually happening?
Yeah, well, it's a huge uranium deposit. It's by far the largest uranium deposit in the world, with something like 1/3 of the world's known uranium reserve. And they also mine copper, gold and silver. So there's a vast array of problems. The environmental impacts, they're planning to produce 70 million tonnes of radioactive waste every year, and they simply dump that above the surface. Here in South Australia, we're in the driest state, in the driest inhabited continent, and yet they want to use 250 million litres of water every single day at this mine site. And some of that comes from the Great Artesian Basin, and they draw that water from a very special, sensitive part of the basin, where it impacts on the mound springs, which are really precious ecosystems where artesian basin water comes to the surface. And they want to get the rest of it from a desalination plant on the Spencer Gulf, which is also very controversial. So there's also those environmental impacts, but the racism associated with this mine right now and historically is unbelievable. And the other really big problem that we've been talking about a lot is the weapons proliferation risks arising from the export of uranium from BHP and other uranium miners to nuclear weapon states, to dictatorships, and so on and so forth.
I think a lot of people maybe understand that uranium from that mine can be used for reactors like Fukushima. But I'm not sure that people understand the connection between weaponry. What kind of weapons? Are they the sort of weapons that are used in depleted uranium weapons?
Well, when we export uranium, it goes to uranium enrichment plants, and that's where you get a massive waste stream of depleted uranium. And there's the risk of Australian origin depleted uranium being used for DU weapons. And they're radiological weapons that have been used in the Balkans and in Afghanistan and Iraq and elsewhere. And they pose a really long-term public health and environmental hazard. But it only gets worse from there, because then the enriched uranium is used in nuclear reactors, and that produces plutonium, which can be used directly in nuclear weapons. And to give a sense of the scale of the problem, Australian uranium has already resulted in the production of over 120 tonnes of plutonium, and that's enough for 12,000 nuclear weapons. So if we do some hypothetical calculations, let's say they do a pretty good job of safeguarding that material and they safeguard 99% of it, well, the remaining 1% would suffice for 120 nuclear weapons. And if you were to have a regional nuclear warfare involving, say, India and Pakistan, or a nuclear exchange in the Northeast Asia or the Middle East or elsewhere, if that involved the detonation of 120 nuclear weapons on cities, that would lift thousands of tonnes of soot into the stratosphere, and that will cause catastrophic global climate change, in addition to the tens of millions of people who would be killed directly by nuclear weapons. So we're really playing with fire with this material, and they're incredibly irresponsible. The safeguard system is a joke. We sell uranium to weapon states, to dictatorships, to countries with a recent history of secret nuclear weapons research. We sell to countries that are blocking the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. It's just an absolute disgrace and rage.
Australia recently announced that it was going to sell uranium to India, yeah?
Yeah, that's right. And the problem there, well, one of the many problems, is that India is one of 4 countries which has not signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. And the NPT is the cornerstone of the global non-proliferation and disarmament system, and it essentially commits non-weapon states to agreeing that they will not build nuclear weapons, and the weapon states agree that they will disarm. And there's many problems with the NPT. One is that the weapon states are violating their agreement to disarm. But what Australia's doing is they're using the weakness of the NPT as a justification for weakening it further by allowing uranium sales to countries that haven't even signed the treaty in the first place. And India is the first country they're planning to sell to outside of the NPT. So a huge problem. And the precedent there, you know, if you look at countries in Northeast Asia where there's been all sorts of political and military tensions over the years and any number of covert nuclear weapons programs, the message that we're sending countries in Northeast Asia like Japan and South Korea is that they can build nuclear weapons, they can pull out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and they can still have access to Australian uranium. So it's a very, very dangerous message to be sending to the whole world. It's very early days in terms of working out the death toll from Fukushima, but I think the most credible scientific estimates suggest a death toll, a long-term death toll ranging from several hundred people to several thousand people. So it's an absolute lie to say that there have been no deaths from Fukushima or that there will be no deaths. There's been an incredible human toll for the 100,000 plus people who have had to evacuate from the Fukushima region, and they've had to leave their jobs, their family, their friends, and they're terribly dislocated, and that's having a really serious effect on their physical health and their mental health. But also the lessons from this. It's been known for a long time that Japan's nuclear industry is scandal-plagued, and a lot of that's come to the surface as well. In 2002, it was revealed that there were about 200 instances of data falsification and safety breaches and safety cover-ups by Japanese nuclear utilities. The Australian uranium industry did absolutely nothing about it. They just turned a blind eye to it. 2007, it was revealed another 300 instances of falsification and cover-ups and safety breaches. And again, the Australian uranium industry did absolutely nothing about that. They just turned a blind eye. And so Australia is very much complicit in the disaster that's unfolding in Japan, both in the sense that we've turned a blind eye to the serious problems there and continue to supply uranium, but also in a very direct material sense in that Australian uranium was used in at least 5 of the 6 reactors at Fukushima. And of course they've spread a radioactive plume right through the northern hemisphere and through parts of the southern hemisphere, and it's even come to the top end of Australia. So yeah, we're very much complicit in that tragedy.
It seems to me that Australia is constantly wiping its hands of any form of responsibility once our resources leave our shore. And when it comes to uranium, that seems almost criminal. You know,
it's all about being persistent and exposing this company for the way it behaves, for its willingness to sell uranium to nuclear weapon states and dictatorships, exposing the company for the way it treats Aboriginal people. And, you know, the mine here is on Cookitha land, and just up the track is Arabana land, where they get the water from. And, you know, maybe it's a bit of history is useful here. Cookitha and Arabana traditional owners fought this mine tooth and nail back in the 1980s, and they had an immense amount of support, and they almost won that campaign, but eventually the mining company got its way. And that was incredibly disappointing. And to add insult to injury, what the South Australian government did was they enacted those exemptions that the mine enjoys from the Aboriginal Heritage Act. In the mid-90s, there were disgraceful particular incidents, and I'll mention just a couple. There's bound to be plenty more, but one of them was where the company did an anthropological survey along a route where they wanted to bring a water pipeline, and they didn't find one single Aboriginal artefact along that route. And the reason for that was a company had been across it the previous day, and they simply removed every single Aboriginal artefact, so that there was no prospect of heritage concerns impacting their plans for a water pipeline. So it's pretty crude the way they operate, and even cruder was the divide and rule tactics that the company used. Back in those days it was WMC Resources, and they used divide and rule tactics against the Arabana that were almost certainly going to end in violence, and yet the company pursued those tactics, and it did end up in violence, and it did end up in several people being imprisoned, and it did end up in one person being accidentally shot dead. So, you know, the mining companies are murderers, but they're not held to account for any of this stuff. Those people, the WMC executives who were responsible for that atrocity, that violence, that murder, they're still in the industry. They're still working the uranium mines around the country, and they have been held to account. And just late last year, the Indenture Act was amended and updated, and it was an ideal opportunity to remove the exemptions from the Aboriginal Heritage Act, but they didn't. So the mine still enjoys those exemptions, and the government acknowledged that they didn't consult traditional owners at all about that plan to retain the exemptions from the Aboriginal Heritage Act. So it's just crude and ugly and racist now, as it was in the 1990s, as it was in the 1980s.
So I heard you put out a media release asking BHP executives to meet you in a national debate broadcast on television. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, I would think that's very likely that call has been made, and it's been made previously, and the company has simply ignored it. And of course, that's part of a pattern. I remember in Melbourne last year, the Federal Resources Minister Martin Ferguson was saying he's very happy to discuss and debate plans for a national nuclear waste dump on the land of the Muckaty traditional owners up north. So we were delighted to hear that Martin Ferguson was up for a debate, and we contacted his office the next day saying we'd very much like to participate, and we're very flexible in terms of location and timing and so on. But Martin Ferguson wasn't serious about wanting to debate these issues. He refused to debate, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if BHP refuses the opportunity to participate in a debate on the plans to expand the Olympic Dam mine.
So where to from here? What happens now at Lizard's Revenge?
Well, it's so important that all the people here and all the supporters around the country, and we've been so pleased with all the support, it's just important that we use this as a stepping stone. It's not guaranteed that this will lead to a significant escalation in anti-nuclear campaigning around Australia, but we have to make that happen. It's really important because we have been having some wins in recent years, but we've got a lot of challenges ahead. So it's just important to take the messages and the enthusiasm back to cities and towns all around Australia and to build this campaign to make Australia renewable rather than radioactive.